Fortunately, for most of us in media research, we don't have to worry about the inflicting the sort of harm that sparked concerns in the 20th century. But we still have ethical duties to our respondents because, in some ways, because the issues that we deal with involve emotions and feelings where harm is perhaps less obvious, that actually makes dealing with ethical matters when it comes to human beings a little bit more complicated. And I want to suggest that most of our ethical issues, the sorts of issues that we encounter when we set about trying to get permission to do research on people who use media, are related to the issue of privacy. So I'm just going to talk about that a little bit now. So, one of the reasons why ethics becomes complicated in researching media use in the 21st century is because of mobility. What we see quite often is that evidence about how people are building society through the way that they use media is all around us because people are using media everywhere we go. So here is an image that will be familiar to all of us, people using mobile phones, doing various things, talking to people, reading, texting people on public transport, which is a public place. And this raises all kinds of questions about whether or not these people have privacy rights. And in fact, they do. However, we were to debate the rights and wrongs of this question, the fact is that as a researcher at Monash University, you are asked to consider what kind of privacy rights people like this have. You can't just wander up to them and start asking them about how they're using media and take what they say and stick it in a research paper. Without going through ethics procedures, because that runs all kinds of risks and it runs the risks of violating these people's rights. So, for example, the position from the ethics committee at Monash University would be that these people, even though, so if we look at the gentleman in the middle of the picture who seems to be having some kind of conversation, he may be having a very intimate conversation with a loved one where they're talking about very personal things. And you might look at this and say, well, yes, but you're choosing to do that on the train. That's your choice. So suddenly you're doing this in public. So I've got every right to listen. Well, from an ethical point of view, from the point of view of the ethics committee at Monash, you don't. This person has a reasonable right to, has a reasonable expectation of privacy. And that's something that you have to at least consider in the research that you're doing. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this particular ethical issue is deeply connected to theoretical, philosophical questions about what media do in society. And I suppose one of the things that we can do here is we can connect practical research problems with theoretical points in a very compelling way through making a very simple observation. And this is that one of the main media effects that scholars have been noting for decades now is that one of the main ways that media affect society is through and we're picking up on some ideas that we talked about last week, is through defining what is public and what is private. The basic concept is that privacy is not a natural phenomenon. Privacy is a state of being, and the division between what is public and what is private is a matter of cultural agreement. When we're talking about the distinction between public and private, that's not a natural thing. That's a barrier that's placed in a particular place according to social values. And one of the things that we discover if we look at the history of media and the history of media research is that media have been instrumental in changing where we place that barrier between the public and the private. So, if we were to look at the history of earlier technologies such as television and radio, these were early technologies, and of course, here we're talking about the first electronic domestic mass media, and these were lauded as technologies that brought the world into the home. And so inherent in the appeal of radio and TV was that they were technologies that blended the public and the private. And also, one of the things that you might notice about the picture to the right is it's relatively formal. It's kind of quite strange to contemporary eyes, isn't it? We have here a family from the 1930s listening to the radio, and what you will notice is they're dressed very formally, and they seem to be sitting in a particular order and paying very close attention to the radio. And this was something that was also noticed around television, the way that when television was first introduced to the home, it was actually quite a formal and indeed public thing. Quite often what would happen is that the first family in the street to have a television would have a TV party. They would invite friends over and they would dress for watching television. And so in a way, these technologies were things which invited the public world into the home and changed the nature of the home. The home was no longer exclusively a private sphere that was completely blocked off from the public world. It was actually something that was connected to the public world as well. So, one of the reasons why we have ethical issues and quite often tricky ethical issues around how to gather information from media users is that inherent in the development of media technologies as domestic technologies, as things that we use in everyday spaces, is the blurring of the public and the private. And this has become all the more pointed with the rise of social media. So it may surprise you to know that from the point of view of the Monash Ethics Committee, social media posts are not public pronouncements. There is a distinction between a social media post and a newspaper article. From the point of view of the ethics committee, we would say that if someone writes a newspaper article that either goes online or in print, you don't have to contact the journalist to ask her for permission to quote her words, because she is writing for a public audience and her words are meant to be consumed and discussed and debated. Now, we might think the same is true of social media posts. But actually, that's not necessarily the case from the point of view of ethics committees. So, one of the arguments, one of the positions, now, there are no absolute answers about this, but one of the things you do need to know is that Monash University's ethics committee regards social media posts as, I suppose, semi-private. That is, the assumption is that when someone posts a message to a social media platform, they're not necessarily intending it to be consumed by a mass audience. And they're certainly not consenting necessarily to have their words included in your research project. So quite often, the committee will argue that people say things on social media and they have a reasonable right to privacy. And now this is particularly important if, for example, you're doing research on something that's politically sensitive and you're reporting perhaps the social media post of a person who is living in a part of the world that doesn't enjoy the same sorts of expression rights that we enjoy in Australia, and may face state sanctions or some kind of sanction or some kind of punishment for making politically contentious comments. So if you quote that person in your research article and then someone can trace that person down through the quote that you quoted, then that's a problem for that person. That person can suffer because of your research practice. And that's something that you need to consider. You need to consider how you can protect social media posters from that sort of sanction, from that sort of punishment. So one of the things that we see is that one of the current problems caused by the eternal truth that media technologies have always complicated the distinction between the public and the private is how to deal with social media posts. When people post things on social media, you cannot necessarily assume that what they're saying is in the public realm. And certainly, to do research ethically, you need to think about how you're going to handle that. And I suppose this becomes a really pressing issue because one of the great strengths, but also challenges of media research, is that we can find data all around the place. We can find data about how people are using media to create the social world every day when we step outside our doorstep. And in fact, even before we do that. So many people use gyms many people use media in many different places, and it's all kind of interesting. So, for example, an example that I've written about was about the MH370, the downing of the Malaysia Airlines plane over the Ukraine by a missile, and I happened to be in a gym when this news broke, and was observing some really interesting behaviors from people who were exercising at the time. And suddenly it became clear that a major news story was breaking across the screens that everybody was kind of staring at in a kind of distracted way. And this was it was very interesting to observe how people reacted to that, kind of related to the things that we were talking about with mourning last week. You could kind of see people being very uncomfortable with the fact that they were seeing news about a catastrophe, but were still very focused on their workout and getting showered and getting to work. And you could see people felt really uncomfortable about that. And I knew this because I was in the gym at the time. And I thought, wow, wouldn't this be an interesting experiment to talk to people about what they're doing and how they're managing this? But you can't. You can't just start interviewing people and take what they say and turn it into a research article, because that wouldn't be ethical. I mean, we can see, for example, in the gym, people quite clearly have a right to, just be left alone, do their thing, and they're encountering an emotional event, and that can be very upsetting for people. And you can't just blunder in and start asking people's questions. You need to think about their well-being, and you also need to think about your own safety. So, one of the things that we see when we're talking about ethics in media research is that the sorts of ethical dilemmas we face perhaps aren't as extreme as the sorts that colleagues face in medicine and the like. But actually, in some ways, they can be just as complicated because we're dealing with far more subtle issues about informed consent, about well being, about managing people's emotions that are produced by the inherent, I suppose, one of the basic forms of media effects, which is the way that media create inherent ethical problems through their capacity to blur our understanding of where the barrier is between the public and the private.